Good evening. It's nice to have everybody here. My name is Philip Federico, and as many of you or most of you know, we were in your community, I think back in October, for an in-person town hall at the Civic Center. We had, I don't know, 300 to 400 attendees, and we've been busy, real busy since then, working on this Perdue case. And we wanted to meet with you tonight to give you all an update as to what we've been doing the past few months and what's currently going on with the case and what we anticipate will be happening in the coming months. So with that in mind, we're going to get started just with a couple-minute video for you to look at and then give you some more information. So again, thank you for joining us, and we'll go to the video.
Here at Rick Warziniak's home just outside Salisbury, the water's been off for weeks now after it was found with elevated levels of PFAS.
Now we're brushing our teeth with bottled water. We're cooking with bottled water. Anything that we think we might have a chance of ingesting, we're doing it with bottled water.
On this day, a special filtration system is being installed to get the water turned back on.
I'm aware that, we live in a very much agricultural community. But as far as, those kinds of things being put in the water, that was furthest from my mind.
Only users of well water or other systems supplemented by well water are impacted. Perdue was alerted to the PFAS problem connected to its facility on Zion Church Road by MDE, which identified Perdue as a responsible person in the agency's ongoing investigation into PFAS contamination. In October, a federal class action suit was filed against Perdue.
PFAS today is what asbestos was when we discovered that it was a carcinogen, 20 or 30 years ago. And we're going to be dealing with PFAS for the next 2 or 3 decades.
Attorney Phil Federico says it's not just the drinking water consumed by residents, but water used for livestock and crops as well.
We have to look at the impact it has on property values, especially for the farmers. And then we certainly look at the individuals who have been negatively impacted from a health perspective to make sure that they're taken care of individually, whatever their problem is medically.
Federico says their ultimate goal, to solve the problem.
Many of our clients have been there for generations. And many of our clients have had ties to the Perdue family and business for generations. And I always think it's important to emphasize, and this case is very illustrative of, who's on the other side of the case. They're not the enemy.
For Rick Warziniak, whose family and neighbors have had to tackle some health issues, they're hoping and looking for answers.
It kind of makes you wonder if there's not a, correlation between this event and all those illnesses.
In Salisbury, I'm Sue Copen for State Circle.
Basically, the reason I wanted to show you that clip was it really addresses the why are we here and does a nice job summarizing it, really not through my voice, but the voice of a real member of your community and one of our clients. And we can, as you can see here, this wastewater has been making its way into the groundwater through spray irrigation and direct discharge into Peggy's Branch now for years, and has contaminated your groundwater. So if you go to the next slide, we'll talk a little bit more about exactly what it is that forms the foundation for our case. I think most of you know, but it's important to remind you all that PFAS is a carcinogen, which means that it causes cancer. And it causes a variety of cancers. And while people may not have already gotten cancer, cancer takes years to develop in the body, and really it's very important. That's why PFAS is considered currently one of the most dangerous things we're dealing with from an environmental standpoint. The other thing that makes PFAS really problematic is it's what's called a forever chemical, which means it does not biodegrade, which is a fancy way of saying when it gets put into the water, it doesn't dilute. So when it leaves Perdue, goes into the groundwater, goes into your well, and you drink it and it goes into your body, it does not dilute from the time it left Perdue till the time it's in your body, which makes it, as a carcinogen, obviously a very real and problematic health hazard or health risk. MDE, which is Maryland's Department of the Environment, it's sort of the state version of the EPA, has confirmed that Perdue's wastewater and groundwater is highly contaminated with PFAS. And they've done this really by testing a variety of wells, both in the facility and adjacent to the facility. MDE's documents confirm that the PFAS contaminated wastewater has been continuously discharged by Perdue, as I said, from not only from a spray irrigation perspective and a direct discharge into Peggy's branch, but we now know through our investigation that there's a high likelihood that their storage lagoons are in fact leaking this contaminated water as well. Our experts have determined that there is an area that's been contaminated, what we call an impact zone, with PFAS groundwater from the Perdue facility, and it is moving in a westerly direction, and it's growing. If you were at the town hall, you will remember that we put up what we thought was the impact zone at that time. There's been more testing, and the impact zone, as we predicted, and as our experts have predicted, is in fact growing. We go to the next slide. The groundwater that contains PFAS has contaminated wells in the Heather Glen area and other nearby communities and continues to migrate. At this point, we now have over 450 clients in Heather Glen and other nearby communities that have been impacted by this polluted wastewater that's coming from Perdue. More than 70 residential wells have been tested, and the majority of these exceed the PFAS levels that are set by the EPA in terms of a drinking water standard. In many cases, the wells we've tested have contamination that's 10 to 100 times greater than the EPA PFAS standard. If we go to the next slide, and on September 12th of 2024, which, you know, I guess it's been about 5 or 6 months, MDA, our local state version of the EPA, the Maryland Department of the Environment, wrote a letter to Perdue, and I want to emphasize some things that are in the letter. And these are quotes from the letter. MDE said, well and surface water sampling data collected by MDE in areas west of the Perdue facility have identified contamination suggestive of a regional PFAS contamination plume traceable to the Perdue facility. The letter goes on to say that based on the evidence, MDE is designating Perdue as a responsible person liable for this contamination and requests Perdue take immediate action to investigate the nature and extent of the PFAS contamination in the wells serving the surrounding residential communities. So when you have an agency like MDE who does an investigation and objectively obtains evidence by way of well water and surface water sampling, and they conclude that Perdue is a responsible person and is liable for the contamination, it serves as a basis for a very strong civil case, the type of civil class action that we are pursuing on your behalf against Perdue. Go to the next slide. So who are we? You know, and talk a little bit about your team, which is not limited to our law firm here. And if we could go to the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about our firm. And we're environmental lawyers. And that's what we do, and that's what we've done for years. And we've been very invested in the Delmarva community and environmental litigation. I'm sure many of you are familiar with Mount Air Chicken and the Mount Air Chicken case that we settled for $205 million to help restore the groundwater in the Millsboro community that Mount Air had polluted with nitrates. We also handled recently a case against New Indy, a paper mill company owned by Robert Kraft, who owns the New England Patriots. And we settled that case in South Carolina. They were polluting the groundwater and the air in that community as well. And then, of course, we are at the moment very actively involved and pretty far down the road on the Gore class action. WL Gore really produces much of its product, which is Gore-Tex, which I'm sure everybody's familiar with. We probably at some point either have or currently own some sort of Gore-Tex clothing. It's very big in, I do a lot of hunting, waterfowl hunting, and I own a bunch of it. But I didn't realize when I bought it. So in any event, certainly this class action is interesting because it is just like this case, a PFAS case. And PFAS is in Gore's products. It's used to make their water repellent products. And for a couple decades, they have been putting it into the groundwater in Cecil County. And so, again, we're very conversant with not only environmental litigation, but groundwater litigation and groundwater litigation that involves PFAS. We're also currently involved representing over 2,000 veterans and their families in the Camp Lejeune litigation, which again is a groundwater contamination case. And then there is a AFFF firefighter foam, which is a type of PFAS. There is a national case that's headquartered in Charleston, and we represent a number of water providers and public entities. So our team is very well versed in this type of litigation and representing communities against corporations who are polluting the groundwater. If we could go to the next slide. Now I'm going to talk to you about the real experts in the case, and these are people who are not practicing law, not lawyers, but really experts and consultants in their field. Deborah Jennings has worked with our group now for 7 or 8 years as an environmental law consultant, and so has Roger Truitt, who is also an environmental engineer. You'll hear from both of them this evening. You'll also hear Roger talk a little bit about 2 of our environmental experts and scientific experts. Dr. Harvey Cohen, he's a hydrogeologist, which means he studies water flow and groundwater and how groundwater migrates over various places and parts of the country based on elevations, based on the whether or not the soil is more porous like it is on the shore and more sandy or more clay driven, et cetera. You also hear Roger talk a little bit about Ken Norcross, who's an environmental engineer, and he's a wastewater expert. He has consulted with corporations all over our country to tell them how to appropriately get rid of wastewater, how to evaluate wastewater, and how not to pollute with contaminated wastewater. You can go to the next slide. So we're now going to hear from Deborah Jennings, who's going to talk with you about PFAS and its regulations. Deborah?
Thank you, Phil. Next slide, please. It's a pleasure to be with you. My name is Deborah Jennings. As you can see, I graduated from Georgetown's Law School and became a partner in a global law firm. I think it's number 2 in the world, called DLA Piper. Retired from that. While I was there, I was the national chair of their environmental practice. And I've worked with this team, as Phil says, for 6 or 7 years. Was very much a part of the Mount Ayr, New Indy, and Gore cases. Next. What I'm going to do is just talk to you in broad overview about the substances and about the regulatory context. Then I'm going to turn it over to Roger, who's going to bring you up to date with a summary of where we are in our investigation. And pardon me, I'm getting over the flu. PFAS are lab-made chemicals used in industry. It's actually a whole alphabet soup of different variations on the same theme. It can be very confusing. But the universe of these substances is referred to as PFAS. PFAS is the summary set of initials, and I believe it's perfluoroallyl substances. Within that group, the ones of concern at the Perdue site are PFAS, PFOA, and PFHXS. So when Roger talks to you about our investigation, you will see that he's focused on those substances and those test results. As Phil mentioned, these are called forever chemicals, much easier to say. And that's both because they're very difficult to get rid of and because they don't want to biodegrade in the environment or in the human body. And as I mentioned, those are the three key ones that we found at Purdue: PFAS, PFOA, and PFHS. Now, what do they do to you? The International Agency for Research on Cancer, the World Health Organization, has classified forever chemicals as carcinogenic or potentially carcinogenic. And among the things that they can cause are cancer, which is what makes them carcinogenic, or increased risk of cancers, including prostate, kidney, and testicular. It can cause decreased fertility, increased blood pressure during pregnancy, developmental delays in children. And by the way, children are especially at risk because their bodies are small, and therefore it takes less to cause problems in children, and they're a great concern. In fact, when they develop the health standard, they have children in mind. It can cause reduced immune response, interference with hormones, and increased cholesterol and/or obesity. And this is not the full list. There are many problems created by PFAS. Next. So EPA, of course, is the national agency that regulates the environment. Curiously, they were kind of late to come to the party in regulating PFAS. For whatever reason, they did not give it a lot of attention and then suddenly realized how dangerous it was. So in 2021, they created a council, an interdisciplinary council at EPA, whose job was to accelerate regulation in multiple different media all at the same time. And that's not the way that they normally do things. So I think it demonstrates how much it's gotten their attention. The first thing they did was issue a health advisory. And this is a standard for drinking water. It's only an advisory, but interestingly, it's meant to be the level at which you have safety. And the number they selected was 0.004 parts per trillion for PFOA. And, unfortunately, the other number is behind my list of panelists to read to you. But anyway, those are extremely low numbers, and they're only protective of health in their health advisories. Then in 2024, just last year, they turned PFAS into hazardous constituents, meaning that anytime there's a cleanup that's initiated by EPA under either the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act or the Superfund, they must consider or have the power to clean up hazardous constituents falling in the PFAS category. In 2024, for the first time, they created a national primary drinking water standard. And here for PFOA, the number became 4 instead of 0.004. The reason for that is that the statute requires you to take into consideration how testable these substances are at that low level and how treatable they are. So once they took that into consideration, they had to make it a higher number, still a very small number at 4, but not as small as the health only considered number of 0.004. So 4 is the standard, but there are still risks, and EPA says in its own writings that there really is no safe level for the ingestion of PFAS. Okay, now most recently, this is just a month ago, EPA established a draft human health-based maximum concentration in receiving waters like Peggy's Branch. And those criteria are set based on the level at which a human being who might ingest water while swimming or eat fish from that body of water would experience health effects, adverse health effects. Those criteria are unbelievably low. As you can see, for example, the number for PFOA, one of Purdue's substances, is 0.0009 parts per trillion. So it's a very low number, and that's based on the fact that the fish bioaccumulate the PFOA, and humans eat the fish, and it becomes a danger to human beings. So Roger Truitt later is going to talk about the findings already that have been taken in Peggy's branch, but the concentrations of those substances in that body of water are way over, I mean, thousands of times higher than they should be in order to comport with this health-based maximum number. Next. MDE. Well, MDE is authorized to implement the drinking water laws by EPA. And so you're going to hear in detail about the timeline of MDE's involvement. But in September, as Phil pointed out, in September, MDE designated Purdue as a responsible person. And that was significant because it gave them authority to mandate an investigation by Purdue. So presumably that investigation is underway, and we're investigating as well. That was based on a groundwater test as high as 1,300. Remember, I told you the regulatory standard is 4. So we're talking about very high, very alarming levels. And Roger Truitt is going to tell you about that in more detail. And then, as I mentioned, we also know that their discharges to Peggy's Branch are very high, and now Peggy's Branch is grossly contaminated as well. Next slide. Okay, over to you, Roger.
Thank you, Deborah, and good evening, folks. Could we have the next? Well, first of all, let me point out there you see a spray rig, very similar to what Purdue has been using for more than 25 years to irrigate cropland, and then they have separate spray operation in a forested area. And the photo on the right is their discharge pipe to Peggy's Branch. Could we have the next slide? So what I've been tasked to do, given my background experience as an environmental lawyer and environmental engineer, is to investigate the sources of the PFAS, where is the PFAS going? And for more than 35 years, I practiced environmental law for defense clients, also known as alleged polluters, including 21 years working as a partner to Deborah in the DLA Piper firm. Worked on air, wastewater, groundwater, a lot of groundwater contamination cases. Before that, I practiced environmental engineering in both Maryland and Delaware, including in Sussex County. And here I'm serving as a technical legal consultant, investigating and helping the team understand what are Purdue's environmental problems, working with our experts to develop the permanent technical solution for the contamination coming from Purdue's agribusiness facility. Work with the legal team here for more than 7 years on multiple cases. We go to the next slide, please. So just to get you oriented geographically, the red circle, and Nicole is going to help me with her little red cursor. Hope you all can see that. The circle is circumscribing the primary facilities at the Perdue plant. It's a huge facility, more than 250 acres. It's actually, the property is a little larger than the circle. It goes up to the north, and it borders Route 50 to the west. You can see Route 50, that's the Route 50 bypass. To the south, you can see Route 50 headed off east to Ocean City. And between Route 50 and the site, which is on Zion Church Road, Zion Church Road parallels Route 50 to the east. Just below the facility is Old Ocean City Road between Route 50 and the facility, which is bordered on the south by a railroad track. And actually, the Perdue corporate headquarters are within a long fly ball from the site, as is Perdue Stadium to the south. A couple of other things to point out. One of the neighborhoods that's most impacted is known as Heather Glen. Nicole, if you can kind of circle that area, thank you. We've tested out as far as Parker Road, which runs north and south, west of Heather Glen. You've heard about Peggy's Branch, and we'll see more about that, but that runs on the south side of the facility, going to the west, all the way out to the Wicomico River, past downtown Salisbury. And then we have another stream to the north known as Middle Neck Branch, which comes in from there, and it actually intersects with Peggy's Branch before it gets to the Wicomico River. But these two streams course through these neighborhoods that are on private wells. If we could go to the next slide, please. So what do they do at the agribusiness facility? First of all, this facility has been there in some form since the 1950s. It's grown over the years. As I said earlier, it's quite large, it's huge. But the three main things that go on there is they extract oil from hundreds, thousands of tons of soybeans that come in per day. 1,900 tons per day come in to this facility. At least that's what Perdue advises. That's 25,000 truckloads a year. And so they extract oil, they crush these soybeans, they extract the oil, and then ultimately they refine the oil in a separate operation on the site so that it becomes edible in salad dressing and soy sauce and other soy products. They also bring into this facility from three other Perdue crushing operations the oil, the raw unrefined oil, to refine it here. And finally, they have a feed mill and a lot of grain storage because of all the soybeans that come in at different times of the year. Obviously, during harvest, there's a lot more coming in. Well, let's just go to the next one. I think that's enough on what they do here. So the big issue is what happens to the wastewater that is being generated by this manufacturing process. And from what we can gather so far, it appears that there's about 180,000 gallons of wastewater generated at this facility every day that is has extremely high levels of PFAS contained in it. The major sources of the wastewater are the soy oil extraction plant, the crushing plant, roughly 60,000 gallons a day. The oil refinery is another 70,000. And then they have a number of other sources where they have sanitary wastewater from the employees. They wash out trucks that deliver this unrefined oil. They have boilers that have blowdown water. They have cooling water and storm water. And the important thing to point out is that the wastewater treatment plant, which is shown in the picture to the left, does not remove PFAS and probably leaks PFAS to the groundwater. And how do I know that? Well, we've talked to our experts, particularly Ken Norcross, our wastewater expert that Phil mentioned earlier. Just so you know, Ken has a master's degree in wastewater engineering from Vanderbilt University. He has over 40 years of experience in wastewater treatment, design, and troubleshooting. Has something like 20 patents in wastewater. So he's clearly a national, even international expert in this field. He's looked at a lot of wastewater treatment plants like this one that you're seeing on your left. And what he says without doubt is that this has no capacity to remove PFAS from the wastewater or sludge, and therefore the wastewater being sprayed, the wastewater going into Peggy's Branch, the wastewater and leaking out from the bottom of lagoons has the high levels that we've been seeing in Perdue's process itself. We could go to the next slide. So this indicates some of the operations on the site. The oil refinery I mentioned is down to the left. You can see the cursor there. That's been the most recent installation that was put in probably in about the 90s. That's Peggy's Branch, the blue line, and you can see it goes right up to the wastewater treatment plant. Well, guess what? There's no Peggy's Branch if there's not a wastewater treatment plant. At that point, the wastewater treatment plant discharge is all that Peggy's Branch is. And as it goes downstream, and if you have rain, yeah, you pick up some of that water, but it's primarily the wastewater, 180,000 gallons of contaminated wastewater that's going out every day. In the middle of the lower part, all those tanks, that's where the soybeans are brought in and stored until they can be processed. And then just to the north of that, between those smaller tanks and the wastewater treatment plant, that's where the crushing operation is. So the trucks, if those of you that live there know, come in on Zion Church Road to the right and pull into the facility. Now, what Perdue does or has been doing for probably 25 years, they've been spraying a portion of the wastewater, about 20%, we believe, into that crop field you see. You see the circle, that's a center pivot irrigation rig like we saw in the picture up previously. So they've been spraying that field with this contaminated wastewater for approximately 25 years, probably more. And then part of that wastewater gets sent over up into the forest to the north and also sprayed there. And the idea when they put it in was to have the plants take up nitrate. Well, the problem is plants don't take up PFAS. The PFAS goes straight to the groundwater. Let's see, I think that's all we need on here. Let's go to the next slide. All right, so as Deborah mentioned, the limits or the drinking water standards that EPA has established for these PFAS compounds are quite low. In the upper right, you see them. The two of them are at 4 parts per trillion, the PFOS, PFOA, and then the PFH-XS is at 10. These are the three that we consistently see in not only Perdue's wastewater, we see it in what's in Peggy's Branch, we see it in the groundwater, and we ultimately see it in the wells that are to the west. You see some of the homes on the west side of US 50 over there that have tested very high for these PFAS compounds. So as an example, the wastewater discharge to Peggy's Branch, you can see there has a high level of PFOS of 694. That's approximately 173 times the drinking water standard that EPA has set. The groundwater test that Perdue did in December of 23 showed PFOS of 1370 in the north end of this crop field. Again, that is 342 times the safe drinking water standard. So some huge numbers that are well beyond what is considered safe from a drinking water standpoint. Let's see, I think that's all we need to know right here. And the thing to recognize is that they knew in December, MDE and Perdue knew in December of 2023 about the high levels going into Peggy's Branch. Excuse me, they knew that in August of 2023, 18 months ago. And in December of 2023, they knew they had it in the crop field out there in a monitoring well. So this is not something brand new to them. Next slide, please. Okay, as I said, 180,000 gallons a day of PFAS contaminated wastewater. That's 65 million gallons a year. And about 80% of that, we believe over time has been discharged into Peggy's Branch. That's 52 million gallons a year. And about 20% has been spray irrigated to the crop and field and forest. That's about 13 million gallons a year. Okay, can we go to the next slide? Now, I mentioned before the wastewater treatment plant, we think, is one of the sources of the contamination, perhaps the primary source. They have 4 relatively large lagoons. If you took an area that circumscribed all of these 4 lagoons you see here, you have about 4 acres of basically open pits of wastewater and sludge that probably have leaking bottoms and sides. You can see these lagoons were installed many years ago, some of them in 1977, some in approximately 1989. So they've been there a long time, which is another reason that it's highly likely that they leak. In fact, MDE, if you look on the left side there, you'll see a quote from an email that we have recently obtained from MDE. It says, "We believe it's possible that the lagoons could be impacting groundwater." It turns out that Perdue plans to remove these over the next 5 years, is what they're telling MDE. And they're going to build a brand new wastewater treatment plant. Well, my supposition and the supposition of our experts is that's because they know they've got an old wastewater treatment plant that is probably leaking. So they at some point are going to fix it, but their plan is not for another 5 years, according to the documents we've seen. And if you look at what the sludge that has been tested by Perdue, that's in the MDE documents we have, you can see these really high numbers of the 3 compounds of interest. For example, the PFOS at 433 parts per trillion, that's 100 times the drinking water standard. The PFOA is 37 times the drinking water standard. The PFHXS is 5 times. So if this sludge is leaching into the groundwater, that may well account for why we're seeing the very high numbers, not only on the Perdue property, but as the groundwater is moving to the west. All right, the next slide, please. So as Phil mentioned, we've retained one of the nation's foremost groundwater experts, Dr. Harvey Cohen, to help us with the groundwater. Here's a little bit about Dr. Cohen. He's with SS Papadopoulos, which is a large groundwater consulting firm in the Washington, D.C. area. He's a principal with them, been with them many years, has a PhD in geological sciences from Princeton, a BA in geology from another Ivy League college, Cornell. His area of his expertise is water contaminant fate and transport, has over 50 publications and presentations. We've worked with him probably now on 4 or 5 cases. He's excellent. Let's go to the next slide. So what we asked Dr. Cohen was, where's the groundwater coming from? What direction is it moving? How fast is it moving? And is the groundwater contaminated with PFAS? Let's go to the next one, please. This shows you the direction of groundwater. If you look at the blue arrows going from the upper right part of the figure down to the lower left, you'll see that groundwater is generally in this region flowing from the northeast down to the southwest, which means that groundwater impacted by the Perdue facility, which you see in yellow there, is going to come across Route 50 to the west and impact all the homes that are on private wells there. And so how fast does groundwater move? Well, it doesn't move like surface water, but in these kinds of sandy soils, particularly in the shallow zone here, what's known as the Columbia Aquifer, Dr. Cohen advises, after looking at many reports by the Maryland Geologic Survey, that he would estimate the groundwater is moving at the rate of 400 to 600 feet per year. We could go to the next one. All right, this is a very busy figure, but I think it's an important one because now that we have been through a number of documents obtained from Maryland Department of the Environment, we can see what the groundwater contamination is initially on the Perdue property. And the way to look at this is when you look at the boxes and you look at the yellow shaded numbers, all of those exceed the drinking water standard, in many cases by hundreds or thousands of times. So this whole site is what in the environmental area we call very hot with contaminated groundwater. Now it's interesting when you look in the lower right corner of the facility, there's 2 wells. One box has no yellow in it. One has only a little bit of yellow. It's only at 5, which is just slightly above the 4 parts per trillion drinking water. Those are water supply wells in the shallow groundwater that Purdue has used in the past for drinking water for its employees. So you can compare those numbers to the numbers to the right, and they're orders of magnitude different, which tells me, and more importantly, Dr. Cohen tells me, means that the contamination on the Purdue property to the west part where they have spray irrigated and where the lagoons may well be leaking is caused by what's happening at the facility. It's not happening from something further to the east. It's occurring on the property. And the other thing to pay attention to here is there are 3 red boxes on the west side, the left side of Route 50 there. These are residences in the Heather Glen community. And I don't know if you can see the numbers, but they're huge numbers for the PFAS, PFOA, and PFHXS compounds. They are in the range of 200 to or more times the safe drinking water standard. Let's see if there's anything else I need to mention here. Oh, yes, I wanted to point out one well. Okay, good. Nicole has circled MW4. That well is a groundwater monitoring well down about 50 feet, and it is immediately down gradient from the lagoons. And look at the high numbers there, 708 parts per trillion of PFOS, 240 parts per trillion of PFH excess. So again, that leads us to believe that those lagoons don't have integrity. They're leaking out wastewater and sludge. Let's go to the next slide. So what we have here, there's been a lot of well testing done in Heather Glen and the communities to the south, both by Purdue and by our consultants. So this shows the combined number of residences that have been tested and test above the drinking water standard. There's a total of about 48 that are west of Route 50, Heather Glen, and the community to the south of Peggy's Branch. The other thing that shows in this this figure, originally Purdue was testing in an area that's shown by the purple outline, and they got a lot of really hot wells for residents in that area. So I don't know whether MDE made them or they negotiated it, but they expanded the area that you now see circumscribed by the orange. So they went out further to the west. Well, through our testing, we still have 3 wells that's even further west or south of that. And we're continuing to expand. We haven't done a lot of testing out there yet. Most of our testing has been in Heather Glen and the community south of Peggy's Branch, and also a little bit in the community south of the plant itself. Yes, where she's circling now. But we will continue to sample until we find what is the full extent of the plume or the contaminated plume of PFAS. Okay, let's go to the next slide, which is my last one. I mentioned earlier that a lot of the wastewater, contaminated wastewater, is going into Peggy's Branch. And what we show here, we have taken samples of Peggy's Branch, as well as MDE has taken samples of that, and also Middle Neck Branch. Let me show you where these streams go. They go right through these residential communities that are impacted. Peggy's Branch, there you see in the red cursor, it flows out of the Purdue property and on down to the west. And where right there, it meets with Middle Neck Branch, which is to the north. They come together, okay? And then they flow together on out to the further west to the Wicomico River. Well, the interesting thing is, and Deborah mentioned that EPA has come out with what they consider to be appropriate levels of PFAS in surface water, or what we call receiving water, surface water that supports fish or can drain down into the groundwater. Kids might play in it. And the important thing to take away from this drawing without looking at every number, every one of these numbers exceeds the safe water quality criteria that EPA has recommended. And it exceeds it by anywhere from 140 to 10,000 times. So we have a lot of effluent, wastewater effluent that's not been treated for PFAS that is now being sent out into the community through these two streams. I'm going to stop there. Happy to take some questions later, but we're going to continue on to give you a little more information. Brent Series, who's one of the partners with the Brockstadt Mandelis Federico firm. Brent's been working closely on this case. I've worked with him on a number of the other cases, the Mount Air, New Indy, and he's working hard on the Gore case. He's going to take you through a little bit of the timeline. Brent?
Great. Thanks a lot, Roger, for that introduction. Before I dig into this timeline, I did want to direct everyone's attention to the Q&A feature here within Zoom. It's going to be down in the center of your screen. It's a box with a question mark. If you go into that, you'll be able to type any question that you may have, and we have some folks standing by to moderate that discussion as we proceed. So if you have any questions, please feel free to ask as the presentation unfolds. So my task here is to take some of the information you've heard and put it in the context of the passage of time as we lead into discussing with you our litigation, the status of our complaint. It's important to note before we dig into this is that the information you've heard today and the information on this timeline is largely based upon information that's publicly available. We've certainly done our own investigation. We've done our own well testing, much of which Roger has spoken to. But in terms of what Perdue knew and when, the information we have today is limited to what we can obtain through Private Information Act requests and Freedom of Information Act requests. We are transitioning now into our litigation stage, into discovery. And that's our opportunity to ask questions of Perdue, to request documents, and these facts will develop substantially over the course of this litigation and discovery. Based on what we know today, the first indication that Perdue had, at least again as of publicly available information with MDE, was at the latest February of 2023. That's when Perdue detected the presence of PFAS compounds in its drinking water supply. This was, as far as we can tell, in the course of a permit application process and water testing in connection with that process. And they provided those results to MDE, who noted the presence of these elevated PFAS contaminants. Perdue at that time indicated they were going to do some follow-up testing to MDE, perhaps in April. But as far as we can tell, the next test results that weren't performed until about 6 months later in August of 2023. And at that point is when MDE performs testing of Perdue's wastewater and finds extremely high levels of PFAS contaminants in their wastewater. That's the wastewater that Perdue is discharging through direct discharge to Peggy's branch and through its spray irrigation process that Roger's spoken to. About 4 months later, MDE, in continuing the process of trying to investigate what transpired here, MDE tests a little further up in the wastewater treatment process and finds very high levels of PFAS in their soybean crush plant and sludge from their wastewater treatment plant lagoons. Roger has discussed those testing results. It's around the same time that Perdue posted notices within its facility warning its employees not to drink from the fountains. I'd note that as we unfold this timeline, it's not going to be until about 10 months thereafter that Perdue starts reaching out to members of the community about this contamination. So sticking with December of 2023, Perdue, in the course of its testing, very predictably finds, we can proceed to the next slide, Nicole, thanks. There you go. In the course of their testing, finds, again, extremely high levels of PFAS in the groundwater underneath its spray irrigation rigs. Not surprising if the wastewater contains PFAS. The spray irrigation rig is showing PFAS. It's going to be in the groundwater beneath it. And then 7 months later, again, passage of significant time, Perdue, in the course of testing some groundwater wells nearby the residential communities, again, not surprisingly, demonstrates the extremely high levels of PFAS in those adjacent wells. A couple months later, MDE designates Perdue as the responsible person liable under state law for this contamination, as has been discussed earlier in the presentation, and orders Perdue to investigate the wells serving the community and the residential community. And so it's that designation that prompts what transpired in October. We can move on to the next slide. It's at this point, again, now at 18 months approximately after Perdue was first on notice at the very latest of PFAS in the groundwater near their facility, that Perdue notifies residents in the Heather Glen community of this potential issue and their intent to test their wells for PFAS in connection with the outreach from MDE. And that same month, our law firm acted quickly to file a lawsuit on behalf of the residents impacted by Perdue's contamination. Since that time, of course, we have continued our efforts to conduct well testing in the area, to conduct our scientific assessment. Perdue, in the course of the testing, which they were doing based upon their designation as a responsible person, also finds unsafe levels of PFAS in many of these residential wells, again, not surprisingly. Despite all this, despite the passage of 18 months and the testing that transpired over the 18 months, at least as of November of 2024, Perdue had stated they did not know what the source of the PFAS was within their facility. The litigation process has continued to unfold, as is not uncommon in these kinds of cases. Perdue filed something called a motion to dismiss, something certainly we've encountered in many instances. I think we'll get into the substance of that after we discuss in a little greater detail our litigation, the status of our litigation. But that has been, they filed their motion, we've filed our response, and that will soon be ripe for the court to address. And so with that, I think I'm going to turn it over to Phil to address our litigation.
Thank you, Brent. And we'll go to the next slide and talk a little bit about the lawsuit and where it is. And let's go. So we filed what's called a class action lawsuit in federal court here in Maryland. And the class action, as we stated before when we were talking to you all back in October, provides us an opportunity to really amass the greatest power and strength legally that we can. We don't have to have every person who lives in your community actually actively participate in the case. We name what are called class representatives. I think in this case, we have a half a dozen or so who represent the group or the community as a whole. So it makes this litigation manageable logistically. It's all about judicial economy, and further, it's about sharing cost. These cases are incredibly expensive to pursue. If you look back at our Mount Air or New Indy or Gore case, it's not unusual for us to spend $1 million a year on expenses. It has nothing to do with the legal fee. It's just doing the work we have to do, the cost associated with it, working with sometimes dozens of experts on very complicated issues. And so we can share that cost at the end of the case amongst hundreds, potentially thousands of class members, and it becomes relatively minor. The other thing is that when you have a unified legal action, you have a great leverage over the defendant in the case. The defendant, and in this case Perdue, really would prefer to fight one plaintiff as opposed to trying to defend multiple lawsuits. And so that gives us leverage when it comes to talking to them about resolution. Talk a little bit about liability. Liability is simply a legal term for proving a defendant did something wrong. And here, there's no question, given what MDE has concluded, that the wells were contaminated in your community by Perdue's operations and discharge. The extent of the impacted area, based on our expert analysis that Roger has spoken about, is growing. Really, this is a case of private residential wells and not really public water. But it's a very strong case of liability, which is a very big advantage for us. It's not did Perdue do something wrong, but really more about the nature and extent of what they did that was inappropriate, and really how we go about cleaning it up. If we could go to the next slide. So the goal of the class action is, and I said this from the beginning, I say it in every case, we're not here to make everybody rich. We're here to fix the problem and compensate people for their damages. And fixing the problem is what remediation is all about. So the first thing is stopping the source of the contamination from the plant. Now they've known about this since September of 2023, Perdue has. And they have said as recently as the last 30 days that they're still trying to figure out the source of the contamination. Well, we have figured out what we believe to be 3 likely sources in about 4 or 5 months, 5 or 6 months. And it's interesting that we're so much further ahead of them figuring out the source and how to stop it than they are. And that's disappointing, frankly, very disappointing. But that's what this case is about. That's why we're using this case to fix the problem. Figure out the source, because once you figure out the source, then you can stop the contamination. But until you stop that contamination, you can't start the cleanup, because you'll just be contaminating an area that you've cleansed of pollution. So in this case, it really is our goal to pin down the source, and it's more than one source. We believe we believe it's 2, maybe 3, maybe even 4 different sources of contamination of PFAS that they are putting out from their facility into your groundwater. We're getting close. We'll get closer as we continue to work with our experts. The litigation provides an opportunity for us to get documents and sworn testimony from Perdue that we otherwise couldn't get. And so that's helping us a great deal. So once we determine the source, we're going to move to have it, these sources cut off from continuing. And I would point this out, this is urgent. I mean, why they haven't moved more quickly to find the source and stop it. They've been polluting Peggy's Branch, every day since September of 2023, and probably before, and certainly since September of 2023, with knowledge that they're doing so. I would think that their biggest priority should be stop putting PFAS into the drinking water of the community in which we are located. But so far, they haven't stopped. They haven't slowed down their facility, and they keep pumping that PFAS water right into Peggy's Branch and right into, it's in the lagoons and right into your groundwater. So what we are going to do once we determine the source is hopefully cut it off. We're going to clean up the contaminated areas, and including the lagoons. And certainly, short-term solution is certainly getting filters on people's drinking water, and a long-term solution is filtration. But there's also some pump and treat that is an option as well. But that's what remediation is about. The other thing is that the property values for people in this area are going to be have been and will continue to be negatively impacted by the contamination. There's the issue of carcinogens being in drinking water, and it really obviously has a negative effect. The other thing we should talk about briefly, and the other part of damages in this case that we are trying to obtain, is compensation for those who have sustained injuries related to the PFAS ingestion. Again, a variety of cancers, which we will discuss in detail with you all as the case proceeds, and also something called medical monitoring. As I may have mentioned before, these cancers do not always appear quickly. It can take years for them to manifest. But what we want to do is create a medical monitoring program so that anybody who develops any cancer down the road, it's diagnosed in its earliest stages, which makes it much easier to treat and much more curable. So this is a summary of the damages we are going to try to recoup: remediation, property value, and health effects. Go to the next slide. So as Roger mentioned, we'll continue to do additional testing until we are certain that the wells we are testing are negative or normal. And at that point, we will be able to draw a pretty firm line. You heard Roger talk about how this water flows, how much it moves over time. So it's no surprise that the impacted area is growing. We will continue to put out our request for information as MDE continues its work. We will wind up with additional environmental experts and medical experts, and we will, in fact, at some point be able to confirm the size of the class and what individuals are involved and which ones are not. Options for resolution, and ways to remediate. I'm always a big fan of fixing the problem and not, playing the blame game. Here, I think it's a waste of time, frankly, to try and defend, frankly, what Perdue has done. I mean, MDE has made a determination that they are, in fact, a responsible person and liable for this contamination. And I really think, as a responsible corporation in your community, they ought to immediately focus all their attention and resources to finding the source, remediating the problem, and compensating you all for your property damage and your health effects. So we're going to continue to work with Perdue and engage with them and see if we can work on resolution as opposed to litigation. But rest assured, as we've done in all of our other cases, if they're not ready to resolve this matter, we are ready to litigate it, and we will do so aggressively on your behalf. So we've been here about an hour, and I really thank you all for tuning in and listening intently, and your support means a lot to us, and it'll have an impact on how and when this case gets resolved. So, all right. Well, thank you all for being with us this evening. We will continue to keep you updated with periodic status letters. And if the interest persists, and it looks like from the number of people we had tonight, we'll probably be doing more of these webinars as things unfold. So thank you all. Have a wonderful evening.